Good morning, YouTube. This video is going to be a continuation from the one from last week. If you have not seen that video, I'd recommend starting there, and I'll go ahead and link it here. In that video, we printed a 2-foot by 6-foot print on Hahnemuhle's bamboo rag paper. The image was a 6 by 17 pano comprised of 6 images in a vertical orientation stitched together. Today we're going to take that print and get it mounted to this substrate. I had originally intended for this to be a 3-part series, but because I wanted to make sure I went into enough detail to give you a proper look into the process, and because I think mounting is actually the most difficult, I decided to break it into a 4-part series. So in this one, we're just going to cover the mounting of the print. Before we get to mounting though, I did want to take a few minutes to discuss the materials that I'm going to be using. First, of course, is the mounting substrate. I've been spending a lot of time lately trying to revamp some of my printing and mounting materials. In general, I'm trying to reduce plastic waste and utilize materials that are sustainably sourced, recyclable, and give me a favorable price point, and of course are going to last a very long time. Now, I won't say that this mounting method is archival, because it's not. You hear that word thrown around all the time by photographers and printmakers. 99% of the time, it's used to describe something that is in fact not archival. Maybe parts of the process are, but in order for a mounted work of art to be truly archival, every link in the chain needs to be archival. In this case, because we're creating a permanent bond to this non-archival mounting substrate, the end result is not an archival work of art. If any damage were to occur to this mounting board, because the print is permanently mounted, it would cause that print to be no longer usable, and therefore it is not archival. Now, not everything needs to be archival. 90% of clients are perfectly fine with a work that's going to last 10, 15, 20 years. So in this video, I'm going to cover a method that gives you a very high quality result and is going to be suitable for those situations where you don't need something to last 100 years. In a future video, we'll of course talk about more archival or even conservation grade methods, which are going to be important for those high tier collectors that are willing to pay a little bit more. As long as this is properly cared for, this is something that's going to last longer than I will. Now, in terms of the materials used, this is our mounting substrate and it's called Eagle Cell. Eagle Cell is a paper-based product. It's SFI certified, which is Sustainable Forestry Initiative. It's extremely lightweight and very rigid. It's built around this honeycomb structure, which makes the weight to strength ratio really impressive. Furthermore, this product costs substantially less than something like Gator Foam, which would be a similar product. A 4x8 sheet at 1/2 inch of this is just under $40, compared to Gator Foam, which for that same size is roughly $110. If you're keeping score, that's more than double. At only $40 a sheet, this puts us at just over $1 per square foot to mount an image, and that is exceptional. There are some cons to using this as a substrate, and first, the edges are very easily damaged. There's really no support on the edges and corners, and it has almost no crush resistance. Just bumping the board will damage it. For that reason, I start with an oversized board and then I trim it after mounting. It's very easy to trim with a sharp razor blade. In addition to the sides being the weakest part of the board, they're also hideous. This limits your framing options. You're going to need to utilize a frame that has a rabbet to cover the edges of the mounted print. Not just to protect the edges, but to hide them from view. However, for me, the pros of this substrate far outweigh the cons, and I wouldn't hesitate to use this product. Now for a mounting adhesive, we're going to be using DryTac Multitac. This stuff is great. It's extremely tacky. Once it runs through the rollers, you couldn't pull it off even if you wanted to. It has a siliconized paper release liner, which is fully recyclable. This is the 25-inch by 150-foot roll, which is about $160. Therefore, the cost per square foot is just over 50 cents. It's not terrible, but there are cheaper options out there. The only real downside of this product is that it can be a bit of a pain to separate the release liner from the adhesive, and it's slightly more expensive than competitors. However, I would much rather pay a few extra pennies per square foot than have a mounted print bubble or separate in a client's home. There are some areas where you can look to save some money, and this is not one of them. We will be using the DryTac JM26 laminator today. This is a cold mount laminator that can handle substrates up to 3/4 of an inch. It's a very basic machine. It's low cost compared to other laminators. It's 120 volts and it gets the job done. It has a foot pedal, which makes working alone very easy. This is a high-tack silicone roller. This stupid thing costs just over $200. I refused to buy it for the longest time. However, after a few mounts that were spoiled by a hair or a large piece of dust, I finally decided to pull the trigger. It's now something that I consider an absolute must. This thing picks up every single speck of dust. Best of all, you quickly run it over this tacky pad here and it's good as new. I honestly wish I had picked it up sooner, even if my wallet doesn't necessarily agree. Finally, you're going to need gloves and a very sharp razor blade. I like to use these blades as the tip easily break off and you don't have to fiddle around trying to replace the blades. I replace the blades as often as possible. They get dull after just a few cuts and a dull blade can completely ruin your day. For gloves, I have two different sets here. These siliconized ones here on the palm are what I use when I'm working with the mounting substrate before I get to the print. They're much easier to get a grip on the board and control the piece as I work. Once I go to the mounted print, I move over to these 100% cotton gloves. This way I'm not risking damaging or compromising the surface of the print. Okay, well that's enough jibber jabber about the materials. Let's go ahead and get this thing mounted.
The first step in getting a perfect mount is to clean your workspace. I cannot stress this part enough. Today we have a little bit of leeway because we're using a heavyweight rag paper and it won't show the dust as much. However, if we were using something like a glossy RC paper, even the slightest bit of debris would show as a bump. However, even with a rag print, there is still risk of large particles ruining our mount, so we need to wipe down all surfaces, including the laminator. Once I have my surfaces clean, I take my high-tack roller and I gently press it against the top roller as I run the roller across it. And this is just something that helps me make sure that there's nothing on the roller that's going to press down on our mount and cause an indentation on our mounting board. Once we have a clean surface to work on, we need to inspect the surface of our board. Look for any dents or imperfections as they could show through on your final mount. Both sides of our board are identical, so if there's a dimple on one side, simply flip it over and use the other. Now that we've selected our surface and we know that we have a smooth face to work with, I want to go ahead and make multiple passes with the high-tack roller. Especially with these paper-based products, after you cut and trim the board to size, you're going to be left with a lot of paper fibers that stick to the surface. So I make 2 to 3 passes, making sure to clean off the roller after each pass, and then once I no longer see any debris sticking to the roller, I know that I'm ready to proceed. The next step is that I want to make sure I have my roller set to the right height. With the JM26, this is a manual process and it can be a little bit finicky. What I end up doing is I raise the rollers all the way, I slide the board in several inches and make sure that I'm towards the center of the rollers. I then tighten both knobs at the same time until the top roller makes contact with the substrate. You'll know you've hit the substrate when you feel the knob go loose. You'll see here that it spins with no resistance. You then lightly tighten until you feel it get pressure again, and then you go an extra quarter of a turn. Now that we have our rollers set, we need to confirm that we have even pressure being applied across the board. Uneven pressure will do 2 things. 1, the board will feed skewed, and then 2, it'll apply uneven mounting pressure to the substrate, which could in turn cause parts of the image not to be properly mounted. So what we need to do is feed the board into the nip and then line it up with these reference marks on the laminator. As we feed through with the foot pedal, you should not see the edge of the board changing in relation to the reference marks. So we have a good solid pressure and it's even across the roller, so we're ready to move on. We now need to establish what's called a leader board. A leader board is simply just a scrap piece of your substrate that is the same thickness, but is only a few inches wide. We're going to end up securing this to the bottom of our substrate using a piece of adhesive, and the point of the leader board is to enter the opening of the rollers before your workpiece. And this makes sure that that first contact with the rollers has even pressure and is not going to give you any bubbling or buckling on your leading edge. You can see here I've taken a scrap piece of our adhesive, applied it to the bottom of the leader board, and now I'm going to press the leader board flush against the front edge of our workpiece and gently apply pressure downward. This is going to make sure that our leader board and our workpiece stick together throughout the process and that we have a nice even transition as we pass through the rollers. I'm now going to take the adhesive and I'm going to gently feed it through the rollers and I'm going to tack it to the other side of the desk. The goal here is to make sure that the leading edge of the adhesive making contact with that top roller is even all the way across. We don't want any bubbling or any buckling. Once I have it adhered to the other side of the desk, I'm going to gently enter the leaderboard into the opening and use the foot pedal to advance it just about an inch. And now use the razor blade to trim off all of the excess beyond the leaderboard, and this way we won't have anything get caught up on the desk as it's passing through the laminator. We are now ready to pass the board through, making sure that the adhesive applies consistent pressure. This adhesive can work for 2 to 8 feet per minute, so I set the laminator on one of the slowest speeds. And then as it's passing through, I continue to use the high-tac roller just to be extra certain that there is no debris on the surface of our mounting substrate. Once the substrate finishes passing through the roller, I advance the adhesive slightly just to give some slack, and then I use one of these safety trimmers to just trim the adhesive away from the roll. You don't want to use a razor blade here because you risk cutting into one of your silicone rollers. And I use my hand to just press the substrate forward so that we have the entire piece on our work table. And now we're ready to grab a fresh razor blade and trim away the excess adhesive away from the edges of our board. Before I start trimming, I make sure that I have a fresh blade, so I just take a pair of pliers and then I snap off the tips. And in this case, I'm removing 2 because I had adhesive on the first 2 sections of the blade. I now have a fresh, clean blade to work with. I put the discarded blades in a safety container, and then I am ready to start trimming our excess adhesive away from the board. When trimming excess away from a board, whether it's the print or the adhesive, I tilt the handle of the blade towards the center, and this way I'm cutting at an angle and I don't risk cutting a significant portion of the substrate away. Now I also turn my hand towards the center of the board so that I'm applying pressure to that leading edge. I want to make sure that I'm cutting all the way to the substrate and that I'm not going to leave a wavy edge. I will say that with this particular substrate, this is by far the most difficult part of mounting this print. You have a paper substrate beneath you and you're using a very sharp razor blade, so it cuts through like butter. I ended up having a few sections where I accidentally damaged the edge of the mounting substrate. It won't matter because it's going to be behind the frame, but it's just something to be aware of. In the future, I'm going to move away from this razor blade method, which is faster and easier, and I'm going to have to come up with some sort of edge trimming solution similar to how you would finish veneered hardwood. I know there's a few products on the market. I'm going to need to test them and see how they work, because that was a frustration for me, was just not knowing where the edge of the board was because it's just so easy to cut through. This is your last chance to check the surface of the board to make sure everything has adhered properly and that you don't have any dents or damage. This board looks great, so let's move on to mounting our print. For this particular print, I ended up having to use a mounting board that was slightly thinner than I wanted. My shipment came from the supplier very damaged, so I had to cut off 1 inch all the way around. The good news is I got 50% off on the shipment. The bad news is that I ended up with a 23-inch mounting substrate rather than 23.5, which is what I would usually use. This gives us plenty of space to overlap the edges of our print, and what I did is I just lined it up and then went all the way around to make sure that the spacing was even. I used the fingertip just to make sure. Usually what I would use is a 1/4 inch metal spacer and make sure it's the same all the way around, but because we had a different spacing, I just improvised and used a fingertip. Now, once I have it in a position that looks good to me, I start using these archival Linesco 1-pound weights to hold the print in place. They apply just enough pressure to keep it from shifting while I go around and make sure that my spacing is even all the way around. In this case, it was pretty easy to get all the way lined up, and then once we were good to go, I just take the leading edge of the print and I peel it back and use a weight to hold it down in place. Once we have our print securely out of the way, I take a razor blade and I use it to prop up the leading edge of our release liner. Now, once we get that leading edge up, we just fold back 2 to 3 inches and then we crease it using our glove. And be very careful not to actually touch the adhesive. We don't want to get the adhesive on our gloves, and we certainly don't want to get any fibers from our gloves onto the adhesive. I then gently, much more gently than I just did there, release the paper from the weight and then apply it by pressing down in the very middle and then working my way to the edges with the palm of a gloved hand. You want to work your way from the middle out just to make sure there's no bubbling or buckling. If you start in one of the corners and work your way in, you will end up with issues. I then do a few passes just making sure we've applied appropriate pressure to that leading edge, and then I can remove all of my weights as the paper is now locked in place. I then do a final pass on the roller because I want to make sure there's no debris on the roller that could damage my print. And if you look as it's spinning, there is this little piece of white paper. I doubt it would have damaged the print, but it's always best practice just to make sure that your rollers are completely clean before you press this fragile surface through them. We're now ready to advance the leading edge into the nip, and you can see that our board is oversized, so I don't need any sort of leader board or anything like that. I always intentionally cut my leading edge a little bit longer and then make my print have a wider border on that leading edge. And what I'll do is at the very end, I'll just use my wall-mounted trimmer just to trim this down. We pass the print in just a couple of inches. And then I want to take the other edge of the print and gently wrap it all the way over the laminator. The goal here is that we want to make sure that our print has a firm connection to the leading edge of that roller. We want to make sure we're maintaining good pressure here so that the roller is going to have nice even pressure all the way through the process. I then use the foot switch to gently pass the substrate through the rollers while pulling away the release liner at the same time. My gloved hand is applying pressure, making sure I maintain that constant contact with the roller. I did not video this process, but before mounting, I did take a tack rag and I did clean the back of the print just to make sure there was no debris or anything sticking to the back of the print. Right here you can see I got distracted by the release liner and pulling it away and lost contact with the roller. And then right here you can see a little buckle in the paper, and fortunately it got cleared out just before it applied to the adhesive and it did not ruin the mount. You cannot get complacent when you're doing this. You have to make sure that you're focusing on the paper and that there's nothing that's going to keep you from getting a proper adhesion to the mounting adhesive. As I was reviewing this footage, I saw that speck in the sky and had about a panic attack thinking that there was a dust speck in the sky, but it must have been a piece of debris because it's not there anymore. It just must have wiped right off. But anyways, this shows you just how smooth the print looks when it's mounted. The colors are terrible because of the video lights that I have, but I just wanted to show you how smooth and how good it looks when it's mounted to the board. You don't see any bubbling or any sign of dimpling or anything on the surface below. The bamboo paper was, I think, the perfect choice for this image. It has a nice warm tone base, and then also the texture of the rag paper just adds a lot to the texture of the sand, and I think overall it is the perfect paper for this image. The last step for me was to take this to my wall-mounted cutter and trim off that excess leading edge, and I wanted to show you this part just so that you can see how easy it is to cut through this substrate. Once I lock it in place with a fresh blade, it's just one swift pull, and just like that, we have a clean, fresh leading edge, which will make it very easy to frame.
Okay, well, I think this looks great. I'm very happy with the end result, and I cannot wait to get it up on the wall. I wanted to briefly discuss the reasons for why you might consider doing this for yourself. As you were watching, you might have been thinking, yeah, that looks like a lot of work, or maybe that just really doesn't make sense for me to do myself when I could just pay somebody else to do it for me. And yeah, for the most part, you would be right. But for me, however, I will always do my own printing, mounting, and framing, and there's two primary reasons for that. The first is going to be control. So I have complete control over all the materials that I use in my process. I can always make sure that those materials not only match my artistic vision for how I want the final product to look, but they also make sense from an environmental and economic standpoint. When you're utilizing a third-party service, you're limited to what they have to offer. Now, second goes back to the economics, and that's margin control. Now, I'll do a future video on all the economics of printing and how you can price your prints, but for now, I really just want to do a brief explanation of how significant an argument there is for keeping as many parts of the process in-house as possible. This print, including the proof that I made before making the larger print, cost me about
$58.
Now the reality is that the paper and ink was closer to $30. However, I have extremely conservative estimates in place for waste, discard, and then wear and tear on my hardware, which is the printer. So it's extremely conservative, but even still, that brings us to
$58.
I called my local print shop and they do fantastic work, but for a print this size on Hahnemuhle's rag paper, they would charge $228 for the print and another $30 for the proof. So $258 all in. For the mount, again, going back to control, they do not have any comparable mounting substrates. The closest thing that they had was a 3/16 inch gator foam. Now, at 3/16 inch, I would be a little concerned about a print this size. That's less than half the thickness of this Eagle cell. Even still, the cost to mount on that 3/16 inch substrate would be $136.60. This brings our total cost to $394.60. My cost, with a super conservative scrap and discard rate of 20%, is still only $32.46. That brings our total to $90.66. That's a roughly $300 difference. When we go to look at framing, the cost of that variance is going to go up exponentially. Then when we're talking about control, forget about it. When it comes to framing, I can make a custom frame from any hardwood that I want in any profile that I want that matches my artistic vision completely, and it'll be a fraction of the cost of what a generic molding made framing would be at a custom frame shop. The key here is you can offer competitive pricing for your clients and even volume discounts because you have complete control over your margins. More of that revenue is going to end up in your pocket. If I price this print at $500 mounted and the client had a frame ready, I would still make $400. If I didn't do all this work myself, I would only make $100. In order to be profitable, I would either need to have much higher volume or much higher pricing. For me, I would rather have competitive pricing, which would allow me to approach commercial clients, for example, and use that extra revenue to scale production to further lower costs and meet increases in volume. Now, that's enough talk about money. Again, we could pick that up in future videos, but I really wanted to drive home why I go through all this trouble. But for now, I hope I've given you enough to think about and that you've enjoyed this part, and maybe I've inspired you to start printing or framing or doing any of this work yourself. I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel for more of this type of content about all things landscape photography, and then consider giving this video a like. And I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Now get out there and make some images.